just let that boot up for a moment. Okay, now for those of you who've been sending me emails asking about assignment marks, I'm still working on it because I've been out injured for a little while. Everything's kind of slowed down. And if you're expecting me to do long-winded explanations in a reply email, I can't type at the moment, so that's probably not going to happen either. If you have any questions, please ask them in your tutorials or ask them with me tonight. I'll try and collate the marks as best I can before this time next week and maybe put them up on UTS Online so we can hand back the rest of the assignments. Some of you have already got them back, many of you haven't. And that's my fault because I haven't been around to actually put the marks into my spreadsheet and check them off. So that's a task for me to do between now and this time next week. So I apologise for the delay in getting some of the assignment 1 marks back. I'm just not in a position at the moment to do anything really quickly. Are there any questions so far about assignments 1 or 2 that I can deal with tonight? Okay, then I will expect everyone's working very hard on assignment 2 by now. Yes? I hope. Okay, tonight we're going to talk a bit about monitoring, control and change within projects, because we've been through the different phases of the project life cycle and we've talked about the different knowledge areas, but the thing is you have to be flexible in projects. Projects, by their very nature, change the circumstances around them. If you wanted things to stay exactly the same, you don't need to commission a project. Projects are meant to change something. Now, as soon as you start changing things, you're going to run into strife, because I can guarantee you, if you're changing something, someone is not going to like it. Even if you've got the very best of reasons for doing it, you're going to be upsetting someone because they're used to doing the thing the way that they've always done it, and they don't want to have to go through a retraining or do things differently. And again, that's a human behaviour. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about project outputs and metrics, and a bit about change management, reasons, types, humans' reaction, critical factors, and a little bit about project change environments. So monitoring and control is how we realise that a change is required, because as we go through the various phases of the project, things need approvals, things need certification, things need verification, and we also need to make allowances for change activities that we introduce via risk management mechanisms and other ways of doing things. So when it comes down to it, change is actually kind of important. Now, if you're dealing with an agile environment, it's kind of mandated that change will just be part of the process. In a waterfall environment, it is still part of the process, but they try and control it a bit more rigidly. So depending on the approach that you take and the type of project we're talking about, then some of it will work a little bit more quickly than others. Am I coming through on the back there now? So I don't have to yell at you? Great. Okay. So now we're talking about executing the project plan, because most of what we've been doing up till now is planning for the project, getting the Gantt charts, getting the sequencing, getting the estimating, getting the resourcing right. Now we're actually going to have to put all of that together and work. So this is where the process of change comes into play, because once we're underway with all of these different activities, change can basically overlap any of it. And they generally come from the stakeholders. So regardless of how well a project is planned, the unexpected happens all the time. This is part of risk management as well. Risk management can identify change that is required. Cost overrun, schedule slippages can be linked to poorly monitored projects, because if you are not keeping an eye on what your project is up to, change is going to happen anyway. It just means that you won't be aware of it. So your project is merrily trundling down the wrong path. And sooner or later you're going to realise that you've got a problem because your budget's going to run out, or what you're trying to deliver isn't now what the client requires because they've changed their mind and you didn't take that into consideration. You know you're in trouble if the sponsor asks, why didn't you raise this earlier? If you ever get that question, from a project stakeholder in a project environment, you're in trouble. Because it means that a change has occurred and you were not aware of it. Your own processes, your monitoring and control somewhere along the way has probably let you down. Maybe you just weren't paying attention. But you've now got to respond to that question. So how are you going to do it in such a way that the stakeholder accepts the fact that you're still competent to run this project? Reacting to unexpected events can make it worse. So if you're doing the gut reaction, it's like, oh, I'll do this and, you know, pray to the gods and hopefully it'll all come right. If you're doing a Hail Mary without having an informed process in place, generally it doesn't work. In many cases, trying to pull a rabbit out of a hat by taking an uninformed decision just makes it worse. And now your project really is in trouble. So when you take a look at your processes for keeping the project on track and navigating to a direction, you need to make sure that someone's steering the car. Because you can build the car, you can put the car on the road, you can start the ignition, someone still has to steer it. This is the project manager's job. So you have to monitor the road, you have to monitor what the car's doing, you have to monitor the other cars that are around you. You have to keep an eye in the rearview mirror for what's coming up behind you. You've got to keep your eye on the fuel gauge, on the temperature gauge for the engine, on the fuel, on the speedometer as to how fast you're going and whether all of these things happen. Now, driving a car is actually a hell of a lot easier than running a project because there are many, many more variables in a project environment. So you need a process to help you along. In short, processes and resources are in place to help monitor the project, provides capability to measure performance, alerts the PM to problems, and this is the main one. If you've got your processes in place, this is your early warning system. If you don't have an early warning system, if you don't have your radar operating, then something's going to happen and you won't know about it until it's right on top of you. And then you've got to clean up because you don't have enough time at the point that this problem is actually turning into a crisis to actually avert it. All you really have at this point is how quickly can you clean the mess up after. And that's usually not a good thing because anytime you've got to clean up a mess in a project environment, you're going to burn budget, you're going to burn resources, and you're going to burn time. If you've got to clean up a crisis, it usually is not quick, and your budget will not change because this crisis has occurred, which means that you're now using up all your resources that would have been allocated to project activity to now try and fix something that you did not keep an eye on. Holds people accountable, ensures resources are used efficiently, and guides the project towards its MOV. What's MOV? What is MOV? Okay, measurable organisational value. These are the benefits that the project is meant to bring back to the organisation, because the organisation is not going to commission any sort of change activity unless there's a benefit. If they're going to invest resources and put money behind a project, they want to see that it's going to reap a return, that there's going to be a profit from it. Because if that doesn't occur, why would you just keep throwing money away? Because that's effectively what you're doing. If you're putting money into a project for no net gain from an organisational perspective, that organisation won't stay in business. So MOV. So project reporting. Generally, the metrics should focus on scope, schedule, budget, resources, quality and risk. These are the standard ones. There will be others that will come into play depending on the unique values of the project itself. Maybe one of them might be to keep a key stakeholder happy. Maybe they're the one putting up all of the money. But these are the key ones that you will tend to use to help measure, because you've got your scoping document right from the beginning. You've got your schedule document from your Gantt chart and your sequencing. You've got your budget that's been allocated, and you did that right back at the business case level. Resources we talked about there a couple of weeks ago. Quality, Ravin stepped in and talked about that last week with you. All of these things have a measurable outcome, because it's no use delivering something on time, to the scoped requirements and within budget, if it doesn't work, if it breaks the first time. So you need a quality objective in there as well. If all the time you go out and you buy something, and I'm sure you've all had the experience of buying software for a game or something like that, only to find that the software you bought is so buggy it's unusable. Who's had that experience? I know I have. Yeah? Isn't it frustrating? You've spent good money for something that doesn't work. Would you ever buy from that particular company again? I tend to get on my high horse when that happens to me. I bought a car. I remember my very first car way back when. I saved up for it for a year and I went and bought it brand new and I drove it off the lot. And this was a car that broke down, you leave it out in the rain. The ignition would short out. It put metal shavings into the sump. The headlights would never work. The air conditioning wouldn't work. And this is a brand new car. I bought it fresh. At the end of its warranty period, the day after its warranty expired, this car was in the shops being repaired more often than it was on the road. The day after its expiry happened for the warranty, I took it into a dealer and bought another car. And I've never, ever bought a car from that particular manufacturer again. And if anyone asks me what the particular car make would be, I probably won't tell you. But let's just say it started with M.
Maserati?
Sorry?
Maserati?
No, and it wasn't Mazda. Mazda's actually a pretty good car. But these are the sorts of perceptions that actually create. Now, myself as a stakeholder was putting money into buying a car. I'd never go back there again. They lost me as a customer. They probably don't worry about that. But if it's me times 10 million people, because all of the cars that they sold that year with that particular model all had the same problems, no one's going to buy their car anymore. So these are the types of things you need to be able to think about. What are the metrics you're going to use to prove that you've got the outcomes that you said you could collect? So data allows the project manager to compile a set of metrics from which to create reports. So things like requested changes, suggested actions, updates, integration management, you're looking at forecasts, approved change requests, scope management, accepted deliverables. All of these are different documents. Now they tend to be very prolific in a waterfall environment if you're going down that particular methodology of having everything done phase by phase. In an agile environment, they tend to be a lot more brief. There may be a version of them, but they tend to be very, very concise because in an agile environment, speed and outcomes, working outcomes are the priorities rather than the documentation. That means that if you have to go back and fix something after it, there probably isn't a lot of documentation to help you along. So again, Agile and Waterfall both have their places. It depends on the style of project you're looking at and the outcomes that you would look to create. But the issue here is that all of them need to be controlled. Whether you call the person in charge of that process a project manager or a scrum master or some other name, there has to be someone keeping an eye on all of these things. So, in terms of choosing metrics, a good metric must be understandable. It must be quantifiable. You have to be able to count or put a number behind it, because if the only metric you have is the project was good, what does that actually mean? Good means different things to different people. But if you say that it finished within 200 days with a $1 million budget and did not go over that, then those are decent metrics. Cost-effective, proven, high impact. Good measurement system must allow the team to track the results and gauge progress, because once you have a metric in place, you need a process to see whether or not you're achieving the metric. And this should have come out in the lecture that you had last week, where Ravin was talking about quality, because when you start going through things like quality control and quality assurance and quality planning, it's about setting your metrics up, having a process in place to check the metrics, and being able to take action depending upon what those metric checks tell you. And that's the essence of quality management. A good measurement system allows the team to track results, be designed by the team, and adopt only a handful of measures, because if you end up with 20 different measures, it's too hard. 3 to 5 maximum is all you really need in a project environment to check whether or not you're pursuing your objectives in terms of project metrics, because you can keep tabs on those, you can track them. If you're trying to track 20 or 30 different variables, then you and your project team are spending all the time checking metrics rather than actually working on the project. And that's a fairly intensive piece of work when you're trying to track down whether or not you're meeting your metric deliverables. So just go with a small number of key ones. There are a number of financial measures to help you know whether you're on track. Here are a few. I'm just going to put up some basic ones so you're familiar with the terminology more than anything else. Okay, planned costs. Planned costs to be spent on an activity in a given period. So for example, if you have a particular task, a couple of weeks ago we talked about allocating budgets and doing estimates. If you've got a particular task like the test results report and you're putting $5,000 against that, then that's a planned cost with a planned activity. Sometimes called planned value, because you're hoping if you put 5,000 in, then you're going to get 5,000 back. It doesn't quite work that way. Actual cost incurred in accomplishing work on an activity in a given period. And I'm sure you've all experienced this one, where you budgeted $5,000 to go and buy a car, and then you actually ended up paying $6,000. Because you found that when you go to buy your car, the particular car that you wanted, which was on a special, is no longer on a special. Or they put in added extras that you hadn't, on-road costs that you hadn't anticipated. So your planned versus your actuals. And these are key metrics in any business environment, whether it's a project or not. You go and talk to any organisation, any manager in an organisation, they're focused very heavily on their planned costs versus their actual costs, because their planned costs is often the only money that has been given based upon the plan. So if their actuals are going over plan, then they're going to run out of cash. And as soon as you run out of cash, your organisation stops. So plan versus actuals. Then we come to a couple of key measures, one of them being earned value, which is the physical work actually performed. And that's calculated by taking a look at the planned cost for a particular task versus the percentage that is currently complete. So if you were planning on a cost being $5,000, if you complete the entire task, that's 100% of the task, then the earned value is $5,000. You spent $5,000, you got $5,000 worth of value back. The rate of performance is the percent of work actually completed divided by the percent of work planned to be completed. Because when you take a look at this number, you can work out whether or not you're actually on track to finish this project in time. So let's have a look at a bit of an example, put some metrics against it. So your earned value, $5,000, your planned cost, $5,000, your actual cost was $6,000. So you spent more than you thought you would to do a particular task. That means that your cost variance, therefore, is minus $1,000. You've gone into the red $1,000. $1,000 extra cost that you didn't anticipate. Your cost performance index, or CPI, therefore, is 83.33%. Because you're looking at $5,000 divided by 6. Schedule variance is 0 because you're still on target. You spent more, but you did it within the time frame that you'd allowed yourself. Your schedule performance index, therefore, is 100%. So you're actually at 100% of the task at the point in time where you said you'd be at 100% of the task. Or planned in your actuals in terms of time have worked out. But you ended up spending a lot more than you thought. So you misjudged how much this task was going to cost by 16.67%. So you're already over budget. You had to spend more than you anticipated. Now, earned value and rate of performance Memorise those formulas. They're not hard to memorise. I keep popping them up on exam papers. I won't say that they're on this one, but it's a useful metric to know. Okay. The lesson to learn out of this, the moral of the story, is that project managers don't lose credibility when an unexpected event arises, because they always will. There will always be the things that, that just pop out of the woodwork. They lose credibility when they fail to react to them well. So if you've got a risk management plan and a trigger occurs and you can implement your mitigation strategy and the mitigation strategy works, everyone looks around and says, wow, gee, project manager's on the ball. If you don't have a mitigation strategy, if you've got no risk management strategy, if you don't know how to deal with this unforeseen event, and your stakeholder is coming to you and saying, Grant, what are you going to do? And it's like, no, I don't know. They're going to find a new project manager. So remember this, because you have to be able, as a leader of the project or in any team leadership, organisation leadership role, you have to show confidence. If you can't project confidence that you know what you're doing, they're going to find someone who can. And there's a trick to this, because even when you're unsure, then try and give them confidence that you will have a strategy to deal with whatever the issue is. Because when everyone is running around panicking, the person who can stand up and say very calmly and very clearly, I have a plan to fix it, follow me, they will follow. It's an amazing thing to see happen, because when everyone else is panicked, the one person who knows what to do, that person suddenly becomes the star. And everyone will listen to them from that point on. And I can tell you this because I have been in a situation where I had deliberately created a crisis in order to solve it when I was a project manager. In the early days when I was young and silly, because I did this, I wasn't getting enough traction with the steering committee. They weren't listening to me enough, I thought anyway, when I was a project manager trying to give them advice about how this project should be running. And I knew a crisis was looming on the horizon. My risk management said there's a trigger about to tick over. I had a mitigation strategy. I could have stopped this particular problem from occurring. I didn't. I let it occur. And then everyone went into panic mode. And I stood up and I said, I know how to fix this. And I did, as the project manager, or my team did. Yeah?
Isn't it then a matter of going, okay, you had this, why didn't you have it before? And then worse still, if they find out that you
hit the nail on the head. Because the problem that you've got with this one is, first of all, it's ethically a grey area that I let this particular problem occur, just in order for political reasons to get more power so that I can make the rest of the project run smoothly without necessarily having to explain myself at every single step, which is what I had been doing. Because remember, I said this was fairly early in my career and I didn't have a strong record in project management at this point in time. After this particular crisis occurred, the very fact that I solved it, or directed my project team to solve it in a particular way and it worked, meant in that project I could therefore do pretty much anything I wanted. I walked on water as far as that particular group of stakeholders was concerned. I could fix anything. And I thought, having an ego, I thought this is great. So about 2 years later on another project, I ran into a similar situation whereby I allowed a crisis to occur in order to do things my way in a particular project. I had taught myself a very bad habit. This particular time, I stood up and I said, I know what to do, follow me. And my mitigation strategy did not work. So I allowed a crisis to occur with this particular project, and what I thought would fix it didn't actually work. Now, when the bottom drops out of your world and you're feeling sick to your stomach, this is the sort of experience that gets generated. Because I honestly thought at that point that I was going to lose my job. Because if this problem couldn't be fixed, they were going to do an investigation, and they would have then found out that myself as the project manager could have stopped this particular problem from occurring that was about to cost this company a lot of money. And, as luck would have it, karma must have been on my side. One of my team members did a Hail Mary. They just did something out of the blue and fixed it by accident. It was a technical problem. And I tell you what, you know, I took that guy out and I got him drunk in celebration. He had saved my bacon. So I learned a very valuable lesson out of that as a project manager, which is whenever you've got a crisis point like that coming up, deal with the stakeholders, put up with the variations and, you know, having to explain things, because you do not want a crisis to happen. If you leave a crisis to occur that you could have fixed, it will come back to haunt you. And my career almost stopped right there, right then. As it turned out, I was saved by luck more than anything else. Dumb luck. The most junior person on my project team solved the problem because I didn't know where to go with that one. Of course, I pretended that we had it all under control all the way along, but the reality was that, yeah, I must have lost about 3 or 4 kilos in about 3 days trying to figure out where I was going to pull a rabbit out of this particular hat. My advice to you, do not do it, ever. So that's my mantra for the afternoon. If you can fix a problem, fix it before it becomes a problem. Don't wait for it to occur, no matter what value you think you might get out of it. Because I was about to lose all credibility. I was about to lose my career track as a project manager. Address problems early, minimise the impact on activities, lessen the impact on schedule and budget. You've got to control those as best you possibly can. Be confident in your capabilities, but make it informed confidence. Make sure you know exactly what you're doing. Make sure you have the mitigation strategies in place. Make sure that those mitigation strategies work, because believe me, it's the worst feeling in the world when you find out that you've actually created a crisis that was entirely avoidable. Early warning system for monitoring. Baseline, project plan, measurement of the actual progress against the plan. As I said in an earlier class, never throw out your baselines. Your first versions of your project plan, the first version of your schedule, the first version of your budget, keep them. Because you need to go back and refer to them, because I can pretty much guarantee the end of the project very likely won't look exactly like it was initially planned. Things will change. So in order to understand the degree of how much things have changed, you need to look at the very last project plan compared to the very first one, because that'll tell you how much the time's changed, how much the deliverables have changed, what change variances have come into play, additional functionality that's been required, time overruns. You can actually go and map it. And you will need this, because if someone steps up after the fact and says, Grant, you said this was going to be $1 million, we gave you $1 million and it ended up costing 1.2, why did you go $200,000 over budget? I can go back and look at the baseline and all of the plans between my last plan and my first plan and say the reason that I had to go $200,000 over budget was because we introduced 17 different change requests according to stakeholder requirements that we hadn't budgeted for at the beginning, but were later deemed to be absolutely necessary and had been approved. It's like, oh, okay, well, that was money well spent then. But without being able to measure where those changes have occurred or to what degree the change has happened, you're going to be in difficult straits trying to justify why your project has gone over. So you need an audit trail of some description to explain and justify why the outcomes at the end of the project were not quite the way that they were anticipated at the beginning. And you need to communicate. If you do not communicate with the people around you, they can't tell you when things are starting to come off plan, when they're starting to misalign. This is your own project team. You need to communicate them if the objectives change or the stakeholders are going in a different direction. You need to talk to the stakeholders to make sure that they're happy with the outcomes that your project is so far generating. And are those requirements that we put up at the beginning still valid? Because some of them will change, not maybe change, they will change. You need to understand which ones. So this idea of communication and documentation to track the changes that occur are kind of important. Change management is a normal part of any project. How you will go about doing the change and monitoring and controlling those changes is an essential part of the project manager's kit bag of skills. Change management, transforming of the organisation so it is aligned with the execution of a chosen corporate business strategy. It is the management of the human element in a large-scale project. Because the thing is, when you introduce change within a project, there are two things that you need to think about, and one of them often gets overlooked. Not only are you changing the structure of the project, this is the one that the project managers generally are fairly good at keeping control over. They have change request forms, they have approvals, sign-off committees and all sorts of things, change request committees. They have processes to deal with this, so within the project they're generally pretty good at keeping a handle on this. What project managers tend to forget, some of them at least, is that every time you introduce a project or an outcome from a project, you also need to adjust for the human element because you're changing someone's job. Maybe you're creating a piece of software that will make an entire department redundant. So when you go to them and say, hey, look, I'm told that you're the expert in this particular area. Can you tell me how you run your job so that in 3 weeks' time you don't have to come to work and we don't have to pay you? How much and how encouraged do you think someone's going to be in forthcoming and jumping up and helping you deliver a piece of a project, knowing that once it is delivered, you have put them out of work and they no longer have an income? Do you think they're going to be very encouraged to help you? Yeah?
Well, the first part is easy in terms of they wouldn't necessarily want to, but if there's pressure on them to do so where they might, for example, lose their job regardless, we're kind of do this or we fire you, then there might be kind of the token of,
Okay.
oh yeah, I'll do this, or just trying to sabotage it, but being very sneaky.
Okay, so there's a response there saying that in some situations there is a mandate from higher management that you will comply with this, and yes, even though you don't have a job at the end of it. But the reality is that there are lots of different ways of being able to sabotage a project. And it doesn't have to be deliberate and overt. It can be just not telling you something that you should probably know. Maybe there's a particular piece of information that as a project manager or as a project team would really help you make this deliverable happen, and they just kind of overlook it. You didn't ask the question, so therefore they don't need to give the answer. But they know that without this particular piece of information, what you create won't work. This is why it's so important to actually get your users of whatever you're creating, your key stakeholders from the user perspective on site. If they're part of the project, if they're on side with the project, if they want to see the deliverable created, then they will help you. It's really easy to destabilise a project without half trying. All you need to do, you don't have to lie, you don't have to do anything to sabotage it. All you've got to do is withhold information. Don't prompt a particular question. That's all you need to do. You control the decision making around an outcome just because you haven't given the project manager the key fact that he or she needed. And this is generally what happens. So the whole human element is absolutely required. Now, this doesn't mean that the people involved are bad or evil or anything like that. It's just human nature to be self-protective. So there are reasons for initiating change, because when we're looking at it from a corporate perspective rather than a human perspective, there are certain things that may occur. So we're doing it for business survival. Our products are falling behind our competitors, so we need to update them. We've got increasing costs and failure rates. Our supply chain is becoming much more expensive than it used to be. The cost of particular resources are well and above what they were last year. And loss of market share. I mean, you take a look at this. At one point, IBM was the biggest computer company in the world. It had been the biggest computer company in the world for decades. And it lost that. There was a point where IBM could have bought Intel and it could have bought Microsoft. And it decided not to buy either one. Intel became, of course, the powerhouse of PC development in terms of hardware. Microsoft became the biggest software company and then the biggest computer company in the world. Either one of those organisations could now buy IBM. Things change. Opportunities, new technologies, innovations that come through. You know, the Apple iPhone introduced a smartphone, you know, right back in the days of Apple iPhone 1. These days everyone has a smartphone. Not necessarily Apple, Samsung, HTC, a few of the others are actually very popular. But the thing is that the market for smartphones is every single person in the world. Put up your hand if you do not have a mobile phone. One. Just kidding, okay. I was going to pull out my mobile phone and take a photograph of you. Because I don't know of anyone in my circle at the moment who doesn't have a mobile phone. If I had have asked that question, say, 15 years ago, there probably wouldn't have been so many people around with a mobile phone. But these days, you know, we're a global population of over 8 billion people. That's 8 billion units of a potential product that could be sold to those people. That's a very, very large market. So when you take a look at your potential market share, Apple introducing a piece of innovation, such as a smartphone, opened up a whole new communications realm for people. And then, of course, other things got introduced to it as well. So we're looking at, you know, smartphones also having diaries, having calendars. You watch movies on them. You know, you SMS and text people. You look up things on the internet. It's your mobile office. It's no longer just a phone to talk to people. You do all of these other things. Play games on them. It's a handheld device that pretty much does everything that you could do in an office. Except now you can do it from a bus station or a train or wherever you want. Lecture theatre. I'm sure some of you are looking at things on the internet at the moment that have very little to do with my course. That's okay. External pressures. Changing cost structures, changing markets, legislation. That can introduce some interesting ones. Like, for example, probably about 15 years ago now, the government introduced legislation that restricted online gambling because all of these online casinos were popping up on the internet and people were losing money on these online roulette wheels and things. So the government introduced legislation that limited these online gaming houses setting up in Australia. So what did they do? What did the online gaming houses then do? They set up in the Cayman Islands or whatever, and they just had a Wi-Fi or an internet connection so that people here in Australia could dial in. It didn't stop them doing online gambling. It just stopped them setting up a physical infrastructure or a headquarters here in Australia. But the thing is, at that point, the government didn't understand that the internet is everywhere. And you don't need a bricks and mortar headquarters. You don't need a physical computer room to run all of these things. All you need is a web address and some software behind it. So their idea of being able to limit online gambling, I mean, whether you agree with it or not, you know, the intention might have been pure, but they spent all of this time and money putting legislation through the Australian government for basically no outcome. Because if you still want to, there are still plenty of online casinos you can gamble your paychecks away, no problem at all. Yeah?
There's censorship and stuff on other items that could be considered morally questionable. Like, how did no one tell that there was an alternate route of kind of blocking at the other end?
The question of censorship of the internet is an interesting question. I can argue that one for a while. We probably don't have the forum for it here. But the thing is, the government has tried to limit internet access when it became a little bit more knowledgeable about how the internet worked. There was a situation not that long ago which they called the Great Firewall of Australia, where the government deliberately tried to limit or block access to certain websites from the Australian mainland, overseas websites in particular. And that didn't really work. They're still trying it. I know in some countries, I believe China, for example, have been more successful at doing that, in limiting internet access to particular websites that other parts of the world would have access to. But it's a big endeavour, because the thing is, websites can pop up and go away very, very quickly. But this is a big thing for governments right now, because the governments, they know that if they control access to information, they control the decision-making of people. You can only make decisions based upon the accuracy and currency of the information that you have at the time you make a decision. If your decision-making is therefore based on slanted information, out-of-date information, or inaccurate information, or information that only shows one particular perspective, and you're making a decision upon that, then whoever has limited your access to the information has controlled the way that you look at the world. That also works on a personal basis. I mean, guys, how many times have you gotten together with your girlfriend and, you know, it's like, oh, well, let's go to a movie. And she says, oh, yeah, there's this great romantic comedy that I've always wanted to see. And you say, that's terrific. I'll go looking on the internet and see what movies are on. Oh, that romantic comedy that you're looking for, it's showing at a theatre 30 kilometres away. It'll take us an hour and a half to get there. Oh, okay, well, what do you want? Oh, let's go to the, you know, the latest Vin Diesel, you know, Fast and the Furious movie. I always wanted to have car crashes. So you go to the local theatre and you watch the, you know, the car movie with the car crashes and everything. The thing is, you haven't actually lied. That movie that she might have wanted to go to that you weren't that interested in is actually showing at a theatre across the other side of the city. But it's also showing in the other suburb right next door, and you just forgot to mention that to her. So you haven't actually lied, but by omission you have controlled the decision-making process to get to see the movie you wanted to see without actually stepping up and telling her no. Yeah?
Wouldn't that be a lie of omission then?
Possibly. Depending on how you look at it. People are great at rationalising away. It's like, I didn't lie, I didn't deceive you, I didn't tell you anything you know, that is not the truth. I just didn't give you all of the information. So I control your decision-making process. And this is how it works. Governments do this all the time. People do this all the time.
So wouldn't by omission they no longer be in the relationship?
By omission, no longer being in a relationship, well, if she found out that you had deliberately created a situation for your own benefit, I think that might be an interesting discussion that you're going to have about where your future might lie in this relationship. But I don't know. It's up to you guys. See, this is the sort of thing when you get these grey areas coming up. I tend to think that a lie by omission is still deceit, but again, it's a personal perspective. Yeah.
Which is why I think most young people hate the government.
So why most people, young people hate the government? The thing is, government controls your opinion all the time by granting you access or being able to canvass an opinion. You look at a presidential election in the United States, it's a great example of controlling information because they're trying to suppress bad information about a candidate if you're on that side, and they're trying to air bad information about the other candidate. You look at the last few elections in the United States, it's not about what the candidate can provide, it's about shooting down your opposition. There have been very negative campaigns. So one group trying to withhold information or hide information or not necessarily let it leak out, while another group is trying to air that dirty laundry. And again, this is human behaviour. But it's all coming down to who has the most and the best information. Proactive change, anticipating market shifts and making a mark. So these are the things that happen. Change is a constant, especially if you're dealing with information technology and information systems. Remember, Moore's Law, since 1956, every 18 to 20 months, a new generation of technology comes out. It has been true, proven, researched since 1956. Every 18 to 20 months, our technology updates. So the information that you have here, the studies that you are going through, unless you can keep those studies up to date through the progression of the rest of your career, you're going to find a year and a half after you go out of your degree here and hit the job market, you are obsolete. 18 months after you graduate and pick up a job, you are obsolete. Unless you keep your skills updated. So it becomes an ongoing process. You need to keep things and knowledge fresh.
Isn't part of your study also kind of teaching you how to learn, how to critically analyse, and therefore how to go, when you have graduated and you are in danger of being obsolete, then going, okay, this is what I need to learn, this is how I can find out what I need to learn to stay current, and then getting off your ass and doing it.
And that's the difference. The question up here isn't university also supposed to teach you how to learn so that you can keep on learning? Teach you the process of learning, not just teach you facts. Facts go out of date, but if you know how to learn, it's the old adage of, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish, you feed him for life. That is very much what a university is supposed to do. I leave it up to you as to what you take away from a university for your own benefit. But if you walk out with your head stuffed full of facts, and that's the only thing you take away from a university, then, if you don't have the critical analysis skills, if you don't have the clear thinking skills, if you don't have the synergy skills to go out into the wider forums and the jobs that you might be looking to partake in, if you don't have those skills and all you've got is a head stuffed full of facts, 18 months after you leave here, you are obsolete. That also means that if you're working on a 3-year degree, you start your degree here, 3 years later, you're also 2 generations out of date. So the stuff that we teach you here, by the time that you graduate, you're going to have to do some self-updating. Isn't that a comforting thought, that all of the money that you're paying to come here to UTS for your 3-year degree, we're going to be graduating you with your first year of skill set being obsolete? This is why I think it's very important to actually learn the life lessons of how to keep learning, because you're going to have to keep doing that for yourselves. And those skills I can't force upon you. Okay, 2 tiers. Corporate enterprise level and the project level. Change prompts a human reaction. Here are some types of change. Acquire new technology, expand into new markets or with new products, grow market share, secure or integrate a supply chain, control costs. Kidnapping staff is a good one. If you actually want to shoot down a competitor, you don't actually have to beat them by selling more product than they do. One of the best ways to do it is to find out who their key staff are and hire them away. Because then you've got the benefit of all of that company's knowledge through these people, and in the meantime you have deprived them of key individuals that they need to keep their product line turning over. And that is an actual business strategy. I have gotten into a war with another company back when I was in the corporate world. Ended up arguing or fighting over this particular company that put a war chest together of a whole bunch of money and then targeted 3 of their competitors, of which my company was one, trying to hire away their best staff. Because this company was falling a little bit behind, and some of the others, such as mine, were beginning to have more of their market share than they were comfortable with. So they decided to put aside profits for a year and then go to war and try and hire staff from the 3 key companies that they targeted, of which mine was one. I remember one of my better consultants, I was going to give him a pay rise at his next review, and as it turned out, I was paying him something just under $100,000. I was going to lift him to 110. He came to me one day and saying, "Grant, I'm going to resign. I just had an offer for, I think it was 115 or something for this other company." I said, "I'll give you 120. And he then said, "Oh, okay, I'll stay." day later he came back and said, look, I've talked it over with my wife and, and got back to the other company to tell them I wasn't going to take their offer, and they offered me 130. So I'm still leaving. And I said, I'll give you 140. So this went on for back and forth for about 10 days. The other company eventually offered him $180,000 as a consultant. He had gone from being, I think his original salary was something like about $96,000 and change. He was fairly young. He went up to $180,000 in less than 2 weeks. Now, isn't that a nice thing to have happen to you? Nice to be popular. Now, of course, by the time that this particular auction had gotten up to about 150, I realised I wasn't going to keep him. Because anyone who's playing that particular game past a certain point, mentally they've already decided to leave, and what they're trying to do is find out how much they're worth. So at $150,000, I was trying to play an auction game where I was making it very expensive for my competitor to hire this guy. I didn't want to keep him after 150. I thought he was probably worth about maybe 130, but he had a lot of potential. By the time we were talking 150, I knew I was not going to keep him. So I decided to make it as expensive as possible for my competitor. Eventually they offered him 180, and he came to me and said, Grant, you're going to beat that offer? And I said, no. And he left. But what that stopped this other company doing is, because they were anticipating hiring him for 120 and ended up paying 180, that meant they couldn't go after a second person in my organisation, which they had targeted. I found out later that they'd actually targeted 5 people in my organisation. They'd found out who some of my key consultants were in key areas, and they were going to hire these people as best they possibly could. As it turned out, they only hired 2 of the 5 because they ran out of money. Those 2 people hurt me, but we were able to replace them. But the intention of this particular strategy is to steal away staff from your competitor so that they cannot fulfil their contracts. As soon as they cannot fulfil their contracts, they start paying penalty clauses, and it starts getting rather expensive. As soon as that word gets around that a company cannot fulfil its contracts easily, people will no longer buy from them, in a consulting services arena at least. So this is a viable business strategy. And I know I've had it happen to me. We did well, my company ended up being fairly profitable, so we were fine. But this was my first introduction to how cutthroat it can get in a competitive marketplace. Sometimes they deliberately go after you if you end up being more successful than anticipated. Undermining the competition, well, that kind of comes into it. Diversifying corporate risk. If you ever worked for Philip Morris, which was one of the largest companies in the world, a tobacco company, and made lots and lots of cigarettes. Cigarettes are not that popular anymore compared to the way that they might have been, say, 20 or 30 years ago. Philip Morris is diversified. It got into all sorts of other industries apart from just tobacco. And it's a little bit like Apple. The Macintosh computer was directly in competition with the PC, which was driven by Windows. So Apple decided to get into iPods and smartphones and all of these things. And now guess what? Microsoft is doing the same thing. They got into computer games, and now they're getting into smartphones as well. Apple got into tablets, Microsoft gets into tablets. So they're playing this follow me game depending upon who is actually cracking a brand new market. A reverse takeover. Reverse takeover is where you buy another company that has a better reputation than you do, and you move all your assets across to it. So you leave your company, original company, as just a shell, including all of the poor will that might have been associated with it, because now all of your company assets are tied to the other company that you purchased. That's called a reverse takeover. You can also buy a firm cheap and just asset strip it, and that happens all the time. Sometimes the individual components of a company are worth more than the entire company itself. So you sell off the assets for it one by one. That's not really a merger. But mergers, acquisitions and takeovers happen all the time. And the problem that occurs with these is that only about or less than 50% of mergers work. Most of them do tend to fall apart at some point along the way. They don't get the value that the more senior company was hoping when it made the job offer for the more junior one. Because the merger was premised on misguided information or corporate strategy, there's no vision for how the collective entity, once you put two companies together, is going to operate. Who takes the management positions? Who is in control of different aspects of the company? Everyone's focused on integrating or putting two companies together without working through what the future of that new company, that new entity might look like. Incompatible organisational cultures. This kills it all the time. I remember working with a big news organisation many, many years ago, and they decided to get quite innovative around putting internet news and internet video up. So they started up another company as an interactive service. Different building, different people, totally separate culture. I'd go into the more senior of the companies, and it would be all like blue suits, white shirts, ties. Everyone had to be at their desks. Everything had to be minuted. It was very corporate, almost military. You go and look at their junior subsidiary, everyone's sitting around with sneakers, shorts, t-shirts, doing fun things on the internet. The interesting thing is that the one with the young culture, after it had been in operation for about 4 years, was making a lot more profit than its more senior brother. So the people in the bigger company decided to, okay, this subsidiary of ours that we created is making a whole lot of money. So all of the managers in the more senior company now wanted to run the smaller one, so they decided to bring the smaller company into the corporate culture of the larger one. The smaller company fairly well ceased to exist because everyone who was now migrated back into the larger company had to turn up wearing suits, had to be there on time, had to minute all of the meetings. These are all of the things that the smaller company deliberately stepped away from. So the larger company found that when they had incorporated this smaller one back into their mainstream, they actually killed it. That piece of business stopped making a profit because they'd taken something and put it back under a regimented culture that pretty well stopped them making money. So it was an interesting lesson to learn. The other thing is that all of the people who worked for the smaller company originally didn't want to work for the larger one. They liked having a little bit of autonomy and a bit more freedom. So some of their key people, rather than go work for the larger one again, decided to go get jobs elsewhere. So they went to another culture that was very much like the one where they started in the smaller company. So they went to that other firm. So sometimes you can pay a lot of money to initiate a merger only to find you do not get the value for it because you hadn't anticipated the outcomes of change. Reproduces practices and processes that never worked in the old firm. You know, introducing something as an online piece of technology, for example, that absolutely replicates what you did with pen and paper in exactly the same way, just means that you're throwing a lot of money to recreate what you've already got. So you need to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. No integration plan or project ready for day one. How do you get everything working? So you end up with mass defections of your best staff, your best customers, your suppliers, your investors. All these people start leaving. And therefore, you've got a failed merger or a failed acquisition. You've spent a lot of money to actually go into reverse. And a lot of this comes down to the human factor. Because even when you've planned out the projects that you need to be able to put in place, what you haven't done is convince the user stakeholders that this is a good idea. Again, human behaviour. Assimilation is the process we use to adjust to positive and negative changes. within every human individual, you have an ability to absorb and assimilate a certain degree of change. Now, it'll probably be different from person to person. But you've got this line, this threshold, this line in the sand where, you know, small changes you can just absorb. It's not a big problem. You know, I've got to go to work, but my car broke down. Oh, I've got to go, you know, it won't start in the morning, so I can't drive to work. I'll go catch the train. Small change. You've just changed your routine. You still get to work. You still do your job. You come home, you get the car fixed. Not a big deal. But what happens if, you know, you've got a divorce happening, you've got to move house, your bank account is running out, you've just lost your job, and all of these things happen at the same time. This tends to be a very stressful situation for most people. Now, if you're working in a company that's going through a technology change because certain projects have been initiated, and you're not sure whether you've got a job in 6 months' time, that can be a very stressful situation. So you might find yourself with this change line that you've got an emotional point where you try and keep yourself below, that you can absorb change. One change, fine. Don't like it, but I can absorb it. I'll deal. It won't be a problem. Then another big change comes through, and it's like, oh, now I'm getting really stressed out. But it's okay. I can still work through. It's fine. You know, I'll be okay. I don't like it. I'm not having fun. I'm not happy, but I can deal with it. And then another one happens, and suddenly we're across our change threshold, and it's like, I've had enough. You know? You throw a vase through a window. You know? You have an emotional reaction.
Is that also adjustable depending on whether you know how long that change is? For example, say the example of you'll lose your job, but if you say know that you have a job coming in and you will worry about finance, but you know there'll only be in financial kind of insecurity for a certain amount of time, would that kind of help it go, yes, this change is going to be higher, but I know how long it's going to be for?
Yeah. If you've got a time frame by which you know that your stress level will be high, but then it will go back to normal, there's light at the end of the tunnel and you know at what point that would be, then that can actually help you quite a lot. It's the uncertainty that comes into play here, where your routine has been viscerally disrupted and you're not too sure what life will look like next month, or in 3 months, or in 6 months. But you know significant changes happening in your life and it's unwelcome. One change you can deal with, but when you start getting all of these things lining up in a row, and I can pretty much guess that at some point in your lives, if you haven't already experienced it, you'll have many unpleasant activities or circumstances all hitting you in a short period of time. Having to change country, having to find a new job, you know, maybe you get divorced, maybe you get married. But lots of different things in a short period of time that are disruptive can increase your stress levels. Now, I'm sure you've all experienced this when, you know, you take a look at your schedule here at UTS for the semester and you find that 4 of your subjects all have their major delivery on the same day, all having the same deadline. Now, is that stressful for a student when you've got 4 assignments due on the same day? Yeah? Used to be for me when I was going through it. But that's what we're talking about. Because at the beginning of the semester you think, oh yeah, it won't be that big a deal. But once you get into this term and you realise you've got all this work that you've got to do and it's all due at the same time and you have to do it all together, you know, it's like, when do you get time to sleep?
Sleep? What is this sleep you speak of?
Yes, what is the sleep I speak of?
I know there's caffeine. Is that the same thing?
No, usually what you find is the students work overnight and they sleep during the lectures. That's when they catch up. But see, the thing is, given enough time, and this comes back to your question from earlier, given enough time you work through this. What was difficult and what was disruptive and what was unusual and uncomfortable, you get used to it. It becomes part of your comfort zone then, and your stress level drops and you're back below the line again. And you become fully functional. I've seen students have meltdowns because of the stress that they've been under in a university environment. I've also seen people in the corporate world. I've had grown men crying in my office when I was in business myself about, situations with the home, situations with the client, and situations in the office all coming together and just pushing them over the line. In those situations, you kind of have to give them a bit of a break and tell them to go home. I've actually done that, just to catch their breath. See, change may be an ending. Something that you've liked. You've loved working for a particular company, or you've liked working with a particular group, but sooner or later, it's over. And especially in a project environment, this happens all of the time. But projects themselves introduce change to a circumstance. So any time that a project is commissioned, a change is going to happen to the organisation. If you're working on the project team, you're the ones that will be initiating this change. At least that's how it will be viewed by most of the other people in the organisation. Means giving something up. In some cases, that might be your job. Because if you're in a situation where change is being put upon you, it might very well be that the change results in you being made redundant. So they give you a bit of money and wave you goodbye. Require more and or different work, and potentially retraining. The thing that you've been an expert in, this is one of the things I find about older people, is that they've got like 30 years worth of experience in a particular style of technology or a particular type of business, and they are the expert. Their entire self-image is tied up on this knowledge that they have that no one else can match. And then something in the company changes so that this particular piece of knowledge, this career collection of information that they spent 30 years becoming the expert in, is no longer relevant. I mean, this happened in IT when everyone migrated out of the mainframe world across to client server and then across to the internet with server farms. I mean, these types of things were a natural progression, but everyone who knew how to do development on mainframes suddenly found themselves not being able to do that anymore. Who knows how to program in COBOL, by the way? Anyone here know how to program a COBOL in COBOL language? Okay. Because I can tell you that there are still a lot of COBOL programs out there in some of the big companies. And this is the problem. If you actually know how to code in COBOL, you're worth a lot of money. Because we don't teach it anymore. But there are still a lot of computer programs driven by banks, government departments and all of those sorts of things that pay really big money for those that know how to program or change or modify COBOL programs. We don't teach it anymore. COBOL used to be the development language back in the day. You'd be going through 70s, 80s into the early 90s. Everything was done in COBOL. Then some other languages started to come in, you know, C, C++, and then we got into other things with the internet, with apps and all sorts of different things. But if you know how to code in COBOL, you're worth a lot of money. I asked that question because it wasn't that long ago someone was asking me, Grant, we're desperate for a COBOL programmer. Do you know anyone in university that we can hire to code COBOL programs? Because we've got a lot of them and we don't know how to change them. But see, the thing is, it's a skill set now that we don't teach. But there's still a lot of legacy programs that are out there still using COBOL language. Those are the types of physical examples of change, because the IT industry today is very different from the IT industry 20 years ago. Not just a little, not just marginally, but very, very big change. Require more work? Okay, it'd be easier for those initiating the change. If I'm the manager of an organisation, I say we need to change our organisation. What I'm really meaning is I need you to change in your job, because I'm going to still do everything the way that I always did them. And this is what you'll often see in many of these mergers and acquisitions. You know, the CEO or the senior manager will get up and say, we need to do this change for good business reasons. We need to manage this change, and you have to be able to come to the party. You've got to make all of the changes, and collectively we'll go forward into a rosy future if we can do all of those changes. What they're really saying is, I want you to do all of those changes, and I want you to change what you're doing, but I'm going to do things the way I've always done them. So you'll often see the subtext coming forward, where the one initiating the change actually imposes it on other people, not on themselves. Provide a basis for resistance and conflict and changing the rules for success. Change can be emotional. You can absorb it at the beginning, but by the time that you get too many changes come through, you're ready to strangle someone. Force field analysis. You go from the present state through the changing transition state to the desired state, whatever that happens to be, and then we refreeze. That becomes our new comfort zone. But there are driving forces and there are resisting forces behind that. So there are certain things initiating the change. There will be other ones that will counter it. And people are in the middle. They're the ones in the transition state where you have to play some sort of game with them to make them comfortable with whatever the change happens to be. Now, change has an impact. Here is Levitt's model of organisational change. Now, it's a pretty simple one. It just basically says people, structure, task and technology. If you change one of those, you're going to change some of the others as well. You introduce new technology, you have to change the way people think about the technology. You change the task list and the procedures, well, perhaps you need to change the structure of the organisation to make that work. Now, this is a very simple change model. I'm not going to explain it more than that. I put it up as an example because there are others as well. You're getting the point here? The reason that there are so many change models is because people regard it as important, but everyone has a change model. You just have to go looking on the internet. There are hundreds of them. I put up about 2 dozen, just to give you a bit of a feel